The man who shot Andres Escobar reportedly shouted, "Goal!" With each of the 12 bullets, he fired into the parking lot of El Indio nightclub in Medellin on July 2, 1994. To the rest of the world, it looked like a random, tragic explosion of sports fan madness, a senseless act of violence triggered by a single mistake on a soccer field. But that narrative leaves out almost everything that was actually happening in Colombia. Andres Escobar didn't just misplay a soccer ball. He stepped directly into a multi-billion-dollar trap engineered by the world's most violent drug cartels. The 12 bullets fired into that parking lot were not the beginning of a tragedy. They were the inevitable end of a system that had been aggressively building for over a decade. And the chain reaction that killed Andres Escobar actually began with a prediction by the greatest player to ever live. Just weeks before the 1994 World Cup kicked off in the United States, Pelé looked at a television camera and made a bold announcement. He picked Colombia to win the entire tournament. At the time, the prediction didn't look absurd. Colombia was a footballing powerhouse, an absolute juggernaut. The previous September, they had traveled to Buenos Aires and completely humiliated Argentina in a historic 5-0 thrashing. The Colombian squad was a golden generation, boasting icons like Carlos Valderrama, Freddy Rincon, and the electric Faustino Asprilla. They arrived in America expecting to conquer the world. But when Pelé picked Colombia to win, it wasn't just an offhand sporting compliment. To the men watching from the reinforced compounds of Medellin and Cali, it was a business forecast. The people who had placed massive, multi-million-dollar bets on that prediction weren't average sports fans. They were cartel billionaires who resolved financial disputes with car bombs. 10 days before the murder, Escobar was playing for Colombia against the United States in Pasadena, California. Colombia needed a win to stay alive in the tournament. They were not there to lose in the group stage. To understand why a soccer match carried the stakes of life and death, you have to understand the era of narco soccer. For roughly 10 years leading up to the 1994 World Cup, Colombian football had been completely funded in substantial part by cocaine money. It was the ultimate money laundering machine. Atlético Nacional in Medellin received investment linked directly to Pablo Escobar's organization and won the Copa Libertadores in 1989, becoming the first Colombian club to do so. Meanwhile, their fierce rivals, América de Cali, were openly associated with the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, who ran the Cali cartel. Club executives across the entire league understood a terrifying reality. Declining cartel investment was not a genuine option. If you refused the money, your rivals accepted it. They bought the best players, those clubs were winning, and the situation had been structured so that cooperating meant staying competitive, while refusing meant falling behind. Narco money built better facilities, paid better wages, and attracted better players. But it also created a structure in which match outcomes had direct financial consequences for people who resolved financial problems with violence. The 2010 documentary The Two Escobars by filmmakers Jeff and Michael Zimbalist drew on extensive interviews with players, coaches, and people connected to both cartels. What emerges from those accounts is that the Colombian national team had been operating inside this ecosystem for years before 1994. Players knew which clubs were funded by which organizations. Coaches sometimes felt indirect pressure about selection decisions. This was the operating reality of Colombian football, documented by journalists and investigators throughout the decade. The people who'd placed real money on Pelé's prediction weren't treating it as an offhand remark. Before the World Cup, several Colombian players received death threats tied to specific expected results, specific games, specific outcomes that were expected to be delivered. The threat environment was serious enough that some players' families were told to take precautions, and security arrangements at the tournament reflected an awareness that losing, in certain contexts, carried consequences that extended well beyond the field. In the 35th minute against the US, American midfielder John Harkes played a low cross from the right side, and Escobar, attempting to cut it off, deflected it into his own net. Colombia lost 2-1 and were eliminated. The golden generation was heading home early, and the billionaires back home had just lost everything. After the elimination, the people around Escobar, teammates, coaching staff, told him the situation was dangerous. Colombia's coach, Francisco Maturana, reportedly urged him not to return to Medellin, or at minimum to stay out of public view until things settled. He went home anyway. On July 2nd, he went to El Indio with friends. His reasons for not hiding are not entirely recoverable. People who knew him said afterward that Escobar didn't respond well to the idea of living in fear, and he may have misjudged the specific threat he was facing. He had spent his career in a sport saturated with cartel money without becoming part of what that money brought with it. He had played for Atlético Nacional during their Copa Libertadores run without being identified with what funded the club. He was 27, had a reputation as a technically disciplined and clean defender, and that kind of player was not particularly common in Colombian football at that time. He may have believed that distinction offered some protection. The people in that parking lot were operating on a different logic. Pablo Escobar had been dead for 7 months when Andres Escobar was shot. The organization that had colonized Colombian football for a decade was already starting to fragment into chaotic, undisciplined violence. Andres Escobar was confronted by 2 wealthy brothers, Pedro and Juan David Gallon, who had moved into the vacuum left by Pablo Escobar's death. They had lost significant money betting on Colombia to advance at the World Cup. The argument escalated rapidly, but the brothers didn't pull the trigger. The man who fired the gun was Humberto Muñoz Castro. He worked as a professional bodyguard and driver for the Gallon brothers. The ghoul detail was reported by witnesses and appeared in Colombian press accounts within days of the murder. Whether every shot was accompanied by that word is impossible to verify with certainty, but multiple witnesses gave consistent accounts, and prosecutors cited those accounts in the case against Muñoz Castro. Following the execution, the connection between the murder and the World Cup losses was documented clearly enough to appear in the prosecution's own framing of the case. The Gallon brothers were questioned. They were never charged. Muñoz Castro was their employee, acting in circumstances that directly served their financial interests, but it didn't result in charges against them. This wasn't an oversight. It reflected how accountability functioned in Colombia in 1994, particularly for people with the Gallon's resources. The triggerman, Humberto Muñoz Castro, was convicted and sentenced to 43 years. But his sentence being reduced from 43 years to 11 isn't a clerical anomaly. Colombian law at the time allowed substantial reductions for good behavior, and his legal team applied for them successfully. He was free in 1998, just 4 years after the murder. He had served just 11 years total. The own goal was 10 days before Escobar's death. The conditions that made his death possible had been building for roughly a decade. The money, the embedded threats, the specific people who had lost specific bets on a tournament that was now over. He worked inside a system that had normalized the idea that match results were financial instruments and that the people controlling the money had options beyond withholding a contract. Colombian football moved to push cartel funding out after this, though the process was slow. Pablo Escobar had been killed in December 1993. The Cali cartel's leadership was captured by 1995. With those organizations dismantled, the leverage they held over the sport collapsed. The league that continued afterward was different, not because the culture of Colombian football transformed, but because the specific organizations that had colonized it stopped existing. The man who fired the gun served 11 years. The men who employed him were never charged.